Ministers, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, good morning to all of you. It is indeed my pleasure to welcome you to IPI and to the now actually 11th annual Trygve Lie Symposium on Fundamental Freedoms. And this year the topic is Human Rights Defenders, a Global Movement for Peace, organized as always in cooperation with the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs. We are very honored to have with us here this morning a highly distinguished panel, including Ine, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Norway, sitting on my right-hand side, and also my very good friend, as is Gemayes, who is the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia, and Michel, an old colleague, who is the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights, as you all know. We also are privileged to have with us Thomas Hughes, who is the Executive Director of Article 19, which is a human rights organization with a specific focus on the defense and promotion of freedom of expression and freedom of information worldwide. And last but not least, we also have with us Florence Giauco, who is the Special Envoy for the Global Alliance on National Human Rights Institutions, with the abbreviation GANHRI, and this year actually marks the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 20th anniversary of the UN Declaration on Human Rights Defenders. It is important, as we celebrate these anniversaries, to reflect on the progress made regarding protecting human rights and human rights defenders, and the challenges that remain. The UN Declaration of Human Rights Defenders tells us that we all have a role to fulfill as human rights defenders, and emphasizes that there is a global human rights movement that involves every one of us. In November of last year, 76 countries, including Norway and Tunisia, co-sponsored the Human Rights Defenders UN Consensus Resolution in consultation with civil society. The resolution was unanimously adopted by the UN General Assembly. This resolution recognized, and I quote, the substantial role that human rights defenders can play in supporting efforts to strengthen conflict prevention, peace, and sustainable development, including in the context of the implementation of the 2030 Agenda, unquote. This year's symposium will seek to identify ways the international community can further promote the positive, important, legitimate, and necessary role of human rights defenders, and how this work helps to create a world where sustainable peace is possible. The biographies of the distinguished speakers are in your program. And after the panel presentations, we will also hear from some of our special guests, including Mukisa Kitui, who is the Secretary General of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, and Larissa Galadza, who is the Director of the Peace and Stabilization Operations Program of Canada. It is a pleasure to have you all with us here today, and we are looking very much forward to your interventions. But before we begin, may I remind you to please silence your cell phones, though we encourage you to tweet about the event using the hashtag UNGAXIPI and hashtag Trygve Lie. It is now my very great pleasure to invite my good friend Ine, my fellow Norwegian, to deliver the first remarks. Ine, you have the floor.
Thank you very much, and good morning, all of you. It is good to see that so many people have gotten up early, got through the blockades and everything that surrounds this building, and can be able to participate here. And welcome also to this symposium, which, as Terje mentioned, is the 11th symposium. And we think it is a very good reminder, a stark reminder actually, each year to have this symposium to make sure that we all remember what we are working for. And human rights are the cornerstone of the UN, and I mean this in a very literal sense. When Trygve Lie led the cornerstone of the building that is in this direction, the UN building, and the headquarters here in Turtle Bay in October 1949, it contained among other things, a copy of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And fortunately, the declaration was not at all buried in Turtle Bay once and for all. On the contrary, it is very much alive and continues to improve people's lives worldwide. So as we mark the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the 20th anniversary on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, we're not just looking back in recognition of these achievements. We're also looking forward and acknowledging that we still have a way to go and work to do. The protection of human rights defenders is a key priority in Norwegian foreign policy. And the UN has adopted far-reaching resolutions on human rights defenders, and Norway has been pushing this agenda for quite some time. And we have been tabling resolutions that were unanimously adopted as of November last year. And all of you know that in today's climate, it is not a given that a resolution on human rights regarding any kind of human rights issues will be unanimously adopted. But this could not have been possible without a very close cooperation with civil society and willingness of countries from all regions to work together. And Tunisia is one of the countries that has shown crucial leadership in driving this agenda forward. So today we're pleased to bring together high-level UN and government officials, experts, civil society representatives to discuss the progress that we've made so far, but also the obstacles that meet us in the work ahead. I have to say, though, that I had never thought that I, in 2018, would take a stage and talk about and use a large portion of my time during a week to defend the achievements that we have made instead of moving forward in a progressive agenda to include new rights and expand rights. We all know that as of now, one of the most important things we do is to avoid pushback, to avoid backlash. We are sliding backwards in many aspects of the human rights agenda, unfortunately. So as foreign minister, one of my key tasks is to consider how Norway and the international community can further promote the important and legitimate role of human rights defenders. There is a vast gap between what the UN member states have agreed and the reality on the ground, experienced by human rights defenders in many parts of the world. And we must take action to implement the resolutions we have at a national level. We have a joint responsibility, and we can and we should work to make a difference. Individual freedom, public participation, rule of law, legal protection, equality, and equal opportunities. These are all vital elements in Norway's human rights policy, which in turn underpin our foreign policy and development cooperation. Our foreign policy is based on the conviction that democracy and human rights are preconditions for peace, stability, and development. A strong and pluralistic civil society is a driving force in the efforts to promote democratic development, the rule of law, and human rights. So they are interlinked. NGOs, institutions, independent media, they're all vital pillars in a democracy. And we're also happy to have Article 19 with us here today. And as Norwegian Prime Minister Erna Solberg has said, human rights defenders are important as a corrective in any society. And she adds, only weak leaders fear being corrected. And in many countries, established democratic principles and the rule of law and human rights are under severe pressure. And I think we all in this room know of at least one country, each of us, that has these troubles. And over the last couple of years, there has been much discussion of the so-called shrinking space for civil society and for human rights defenders in several countries around the world. And governments that restrict the space for free debate and information sharing seems to be learning from and copying each other. Worst practices are being shared between countries instead of best practices. And these trends has to be reversed. And we must not give up. We have to fight back. And we have to expand and strengthen the democratic space and reach out across regional groups and forge new and deepen our existing partnerships. Article 1 of the Declaration on Human Rights Defenders says that, and I quote this, "Everyone has the right, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels," end quote. We should all make full use of this right. Previous generations have fought hard for this to happen. And without their courage and their determination, many of us would not be in this room today. And I'm thinking of the many women and men who fought for equal rights for men and women, including women's rights to education, to knowledge, the right to vote, the right to decide whether to have children, and if so, how many. Centuries of prejudice and discrimination have been pushed back, and change is possible. Today, our focus is on the role of women and men like these and on human rights defenders. People who speak out, who criticize authorities, who defend vulnerable groups such as ethnic or religious minorities, journalists who document human rights violations like torture and the use of hunger as a weapon of war. Human rights defenders include lawyers, journalists, trade union activists, but also employees in national institutions, anyone peacefully advocating in support of human rights. Women human rights defenders are very often in the front line and have a heightened risk of abuse, including gender-based and sexual violence. Human rights defenders, they speak out on behalf of others, or rather, they speak out on behalf of all of us. Not only do they give a voice to victims of human rights violations, they also speak on behalf of humanity as a whole, and the values that are so dear to us. And regardless of whether people are fighting for freedom of expression, freedom of religion, indigenous rights, gender equality, LGBTI rights, we will insist on their need and their right to be heard. No one should risk being harassed, persecuted, or attacked just because of opinions they express. In many countries, human rights defenders and journalists are threatened, imprisoned, or even killed merely for doing their job. Using their voice, their knowledge, their pen, their camera, their mobile phone to document all of the things that are happening, like social issues, to reveal injustice or present alternatives can entail huge risk to them. According to a recent report by the UN Secretary General, at least 1,019 human rights defenders were killed in 61 countries from 2015 to 2017. And attacks like this often occur after human rights defenders have spoken out about basic human rights violations. When the village drinking water is poisoned, when a blogger is imprisoned because he or she disagrees with the people in power, when a young student takes part in peaceful demonstration and is met with police violence and long prison sentence, when people are not allowed to go to church or to the mosque, or when an LGBTI activist is killed. Every day, human rights defenders across the globe show extraordinary courage. And we, for our part, we have to defend the defenders. The promotion and protection of human rights is responsibility of every UN member state. All states have a shared obligation to support and to protect those who are working so hard to bring about change. And this is why Norway supports individuals, organizations, networks that are fighting for human rights in many countries. And will continue to do so. Norway will continue our efforts to translate UN resolutions into action. And we will do so in multilateral arenas and through our foreign missions and partners. And of course, we will do so in close cooperation with and support to human rights organizations. The reason why human rights are not respected is very often a lack of political will. But in some cases, it's also a question of resources and weak governance. This is why Norway is advocating for a stronger human rights pillar in the UN, which should include effective capacity building and technical support to member states. Strengthening national capabilities will have a direct impact on countries' ability to observe and respect human rights, and to their ability to ensure that human rights can be enjoyed by everyone. It is an honor to be joined by one of the people who will be instrumental in this work, the newly appointed High Commissioner on Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet. And this Sunday, the High Commissioner and I signed a 4-year agreement where Norway and the Office of the High Commissioner have decided to enter into a partnership that consists of $85 million over 4 years to make sure that her office and the human rights work in the UN has a predictable financing, but could also do more prevention instead of always trying to repair what has gone wrong. When you delivered your first opening statement at the Human Rights Council just a few weeks ago, we listened with interest, we listened with hope. And I want to pick up on one element in particular. In your call for greater engagement by member states, you pointed out that this doesn't mean disputes or withdrawals. It means coordinated and cooperative work for common principles and goals. Because the best solutions are grounded in principle and openness, and because, as you said, consensus is possible. I note that I get very excited when I read your quotes, because I think you're absolutely right. Consensus is possible, and I think that the vote in November showed that it is. Ideal solutions may not always be possible. And I would take it one step further and say that they are very seldom available, but we still have to work with what we got. That should never discourage us from aspiring for higher ideals. In that endeavor, you can always count on Norway. 70 years ago, our forefathers and our mothers led the cornerstone of the UN. And UN is literally built upon the Human Rights Declaration. We are now called to defend this declaration. We are called to defend this foundation and to build on it and developing it further. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ine, for those inspiring and I would say in so many ways encouraging words, but also for sharing with us some very promising numbers and also some very shocking numbers on the state of affairs in the field at hand. Before I turn to the next presenter, let me remind you that I will open the floor for questions and answers following the presentations. If you are joining us online, you are welcome to tweet in your questions and comments. And we will now hear from Remayes, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of Tunisia. Remayes, you have the floor.
Thank you, Terry, for your kind invitation. Madam Minister, Madam High Commissioner for Human Rights, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it gives me a great pleasure to take part this morning in this 11th edition of the annual symposium, Trygve Lie, entitled Human Rights Defenders, a Global Movement for Peace. I would like to thank the International Peace Institute and Her Excellency, the Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Kingdom of Norway, for selecting a topic of particular relevance to our collective efforts for achieving sustainable peace. As we celebrate the 70th anniversary of Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the 20th anniversary of the United Nations Declaration on Human Rights Defenders, let me reiterate our strong commitment to these two landmark declarations. Guided by the spirit of our new constitutions, adopted in 2014, and which embodies progressive rights and freedoms, we stress our determination to continue our efforts to achieve a well-functioning national human rights system and to promote and strengthen state structure and mechanism for the promotion and protection of human rights, thus creating a safe and enabling environment for all those who engage in defending and safeguarding human rights and in contributing to peace and sustainable development. In this regard, Tunisia welcomes the increased focus on human rights defenders, as we believe that their work is essential for the advancement of human rights, democracy, and the rule of law. We are fully engaged in supporting initiatives for protecting human rights defenders. Thus, our continuous strong support to Norway annual resolution on human rights defenders in the Human Rights Council in Geneva and in the General Assembly in New York, as well as our partnership with Ireland in introducing the first ever resolution on the Human Rights Council on civil society space, and with Sweden in initiating the first ever resolution on Human Rights Council on freedom of expression in the Internet. Building a bridge between these three resolutions, covering such a crucial dimension of human rights, demonstrates Tunisia's multidimensional approach to human rights designed to protect and promote all fundamental freedoms and human rights, including economic, social, and cultural rights. It is also a testimony of our appreciation of the role and contribution of human rights defenders and civil society actors. The role of civil society is particularly important. The award of 2015 Nobel Prize to the Tunisian civil society, represented by the National Dialogue Quartet, is in recognition of the civil society role and its contribution in promoting dialogue and political solution by building consensus across political groups. Partnership with civil society has become instrumental in our policies and programs for achieving inclusive and sustainable development, which is, in our view, a multi-stakeholder and comprehensive endeavor that encompasses public, private, and civil society actors. Comprehensive because disparities and inequality within and among nations could lead to violation of human rights and to undermining development, thus threatening peace and stability. This was the essence of the Tunis imperative used by the former Human Rights High Commissioner, Nevi Pillay. Peace and growth are not sustainable if they don't reap benefits to all nations, region, gender, ages, social status, etc. This inextricable link between respect for human rights, sustainable peace and development is a cornerstone of the 2030 Development Agenda, with its main and major objective of leaving no one behind. In our view, this goal cannot be fully achieved without the active contribution of civil society actors, including human rights defenders. Hundreds of thousands of people around the world strive to defend fundamental rights, often in the face of threat coming from extremist and terrorist groups, as well as from organized crime. Our task is to protect them and create the enabling and safe environment for them to fulfill their task. We in Tunisia, we are determined to do so and to safeguard all the tenets to allow our young democracy to thrive. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Jamais. Again, inspiring and promising words and very constructive commitments from Tunisia. And I think Tunisia's efforts in this field is highly, highly commendable. Last year, we had Prince Zaid here sitting where you are sitting now, and I said that he was the most courageous man in the world. And I think in order to take on that job, you have to be the most courageous woman in the world, because this is asking to be criticized left, right, and center. You have to stand in the bully pulpit and criticize leaders in this world. So maybe I should ask you, how did you dare to take the job? You have the floor, Michelle.
Thank you, distinguished President of the International Peace Institute, my fellow panelists, excellencies, colleagues, and friends. Well, first of all, I want to thank the government of Norway for their strong support for human rights, because, as the minister have mentioned, human rights is being pushed back, and I think we need to, all of us, don't give up and push back to put the human rights issue in the agenda, in the multilateral system in a stronger way. So thank you so much for that, Madam Minister. And I am delighted that this is one of my, first engagement in terms of that I'm only 3 weeks in the office, and so as High Commissioner for Human Rights. But I've been here in many capacities. I've been here as President of the Republic. I've been here with the Prime Minister of Norway, discussing about foreign fighters some years ago, and I've been as UN Women Executive Director too, discussing. So it's great to be in this new role. So we are here in memory of Trygve Lie, the first UN Secretary General. And it's interesting because it was during his mandate that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was drafted and adopted 70 years ago. This great document with this magnificent language proclaims that, and it has been already remind us, that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity and rights. Furthermore, and this is too often forgotten, the Universal Declaration lays out the very practical and detailed steps which lay the path away from conflict and deprivation, leading to the effective realization of human rights. And I'm deeply honored to have received the mandate to protect and promote human rights across the world on this, the 70th anniversary of this great promise by all states to the peoples. The Universal Declaration is a living document, a constant and universal commitment to every human being. As Trygve Lie himself said, and I quote, "The Declaration is helping greater numbers of people all the time, to be more articulate and effective in demanding and securing observance of the right." Excellencies, it was during the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration that the General Assembly adopted the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders, officially known as Declaration on the Right and Responsibility of Individuals, Groups, and Organs of Society to Promote and Protect Universally Recognized Human Rights and Fundamental Freedom. It's yesterday in activity celebrating the 70th anniversary of the Universal Declaration for Human Rights. There were other two predecessors. So Louise Arbour and Mary Robinson, and Mary Robinson was telling us that she was a High Commissioner when 50 years ago the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders was approved. This declaration grants every person the right, and I quote again, individually and in association with others, to promote and to strive for the protection and realization of human rights and fundamental freedoms at the national and international levels, as we have heard. It brought new recognition to civil society activists and made it clear that the effective implementation of human rights principles and law very much depends on the work of activists and civil society groups. It was a commitment to protect human rights defenders and their rights to freedom of assembly and association. It was also a commitment to ensure freedom of information, to acknowledge the rights of groups and individuals to publish, discuss, and draw public attention to human rights-related matters, the right to develop new human rights ideas and to advocate their acceptance, and their right to participate in public affairs. At that time, the late Kofi Annan was the Secretary General. He described the core of the Declaration of Human Rights Defenders in these terms, and I quote, "When the rights of human rights defenders are violated, all of our rights are put in jeopardy, and all of us are made less safe." 20 years after the Declaration of Human Rights Defender, and 70 years after the adoption of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, we would say progress has been achieved. Across the globe, the power of civil society participation has underpinned tremendous progress in human dignity, economic and social well-being, and a result of openness and inclusiveness, more effective governance. Many historic breakthroughs have been made in numerous countries to advance towards greater equality and freedom for women, members of ethnic, religious, and caste minorities, and many other groups, including LGBTI communities and people with disabilities. Heroic men and women have stepped forward to claim rights for their fellow human beings, and many have succeeded. In numerous countries, strong traditions have taken root of ordinary people joining together in common causes for the betterment of all. In their voices, we hear the Universal Declaration of Human Rights proclaim the will of the people should be the basis of the authority of government. Nevertheless, there are some dark clouds. In recent years, we have seen space for civil society closing in a wide range of countries on every continent. Government has imposed restrictions on the ability of civil society groups to operate or to receive funding, or have failed in their obligations to include, recognize, and protect defenders whose work and person is attacked. Human rights defenders are falsely vilified as traitors and terrorists. They face smear and disinformation campaign, harassment and intimidation, and this is particularly the case for women and for LGBTI human rights defenders, who often suffer attacks of sexualized nature. Defenders are threatened by officials, their offices raided and ransacked. They may be also arbitrarily detained or left unprotected to face physical assault, gender-based violence, or even murder. We're seeing violent crackdowns on peaceful demonstrations and harsh prison sentences for the exercise of fundamental rights. We're also witnessing widespread efforts to silence, delegitimize, and specifically target women's human rights defenders simply because they're women or because of their efforts to promote gender equality. Digital technologies are being used to further restrict the civic space in many countries, enabling intrusive practices which attack the right to privacy. In contradiction with international human rights law, human rights defenders are being tracked, facilitating their arrest or attacked by private actors. Demands are also made on private communication platforms to transmit confidential information about people reporting on human rights violations. Online campaigns against women human rights defenders aim to damage their credibility as advocates, diminish the power of their voices, and restrict the already limited public space in which women's activists can mobilize and make a difference. In a number of countries, even the individuals and groups who assist the human rights works of the United Nations are openly under attack. And the Assistant Secretary General for Human Rights recently reported on his report of reprisals, acts of serious cruelty against those who dare to cooperate with us, incommunicado detention, torture and ill treatment, prolonged solitary confinement, and even killing. We have also received reports of sexual assault, threats of rape, online smear campaigns, intrusive physical searches, humiliating and degrading treatment, and travel bans intended to block people from having access to United Nations bodies. The magnitude and scope of these reprisals against people who cooperate with human bodies is far-reaching, and their impact is visible in countries where our staff often encounter people too afraid to speak with them. The breadth of attacks of human rights defenders across societies is overwhelming. By shutting down the active voices of the people, this assault on rights profoundly undermines the state's ability to respond to important concerns and erodes the pillars of sustainable development and peace. People's right to claim their rights is essential in and of itself, but it is also a driver of numerous other benefits. The meaningful participation of civil society in decision-making is more likely to ensure the fair distribution of resources. And I, as former president, I can say when you you work with the people, your policies are more sustainable because they take in consideration their people concerns and you look for solutions to that. It is essential to implementing the agenda for sustainable development. And this holds true for every area: health, housing, water, and of course, climate change. The best solution will be found when those affected are meaningfully involved in identifying the best way forward, even if they can provide feedback once implementation has begun. Because, papers can accept beautiful policies, but sometimes papers don't reflect reality. Activism is also a strong driver of confidence in important institutions and of access to fundamental goods. In this sense, it can act as a powerful antidote to extremism. We need to hammer this message home. Criticism and debate do not constitute terrorism. They are a preventive tool against the rise of violent extremist groups. So, what can we do at this time when fundamental rights are so sorely under pressure? There is a way forward, like my dear minister has said, and it is to fight back. We need to stand up for human rights. We need to insist on spaces of inclusion and safety for civil society, including all human rights defenders and, of course, journalists. Many journalists have been murdered in these years. We need to safeguard the lives and the work of people across the world, not only in our own societies, who are struggling to shape a world of greater equality, greater peace, greater dignity, and well-being. We need to speak out for fundamental freedoms. We need to counter the false and negative narrative that stigmatize human rights defenders as enemies and remind officials and public constituencies alike that there is nothing more patriotic than fighting for the public good. We need to help defenders and activists join up in networks to defend the space for their activity. We need to build bridges to widen the constituency for human rights. We need to encourage businesses, including technology companies, to play a larger role in protecting the work of defenders, because public freedoms are good for people, but also good for business. And we need to build that business case. We need more effective accountability efforts at national, regional, and international levels. We need them to take into account the experiences and voices of women defenders and others who face specific forms of discrimination and violence. We need to ensure that the civic space for all defenders to advocate for human rights at the UN and other international fora is vigorously protected and expanded. And we need to remind governments that they promised, for good reasons, to uphold these rights, because they build societies that are more harmonious and more resilient, societies that are strong because they are fair. I look forward to hearing our other panelists and your thoughts. Thank you. How we can work together. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I cannot resist saying it's all apparent, right person, right place. We will now hear from Thomas Hughes, who is the Executive Director of Article 19. So, Thomas, we look forward to your reflections. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much to IPI for the invitation to be here today, to join you on the panel, to celebrate, to mark the annual Trygve Lie Symposium on Fundamental Freedoms. The theme of this year's high-level week is making the United Nations relevant to all people. And I think if there is a community that makes the UN relevant on the ground, and there is a community which really embodies the we the people component of the UN Charter, then it is human rights defenders. And the many forms that we see these individuals take, whether it be a journalist, a blogger, an environmental activist, a gender equality campaigner, or even the lawyers that represent them on a regular basis. It's these individuals who are undoubtedly at the front lines of the promotion of human rights, and it is them who will help the world realize the ambitious goals that were set in motion 70 years ago. And that is why their defense and discussions around their defense and promotion of international standards for their defense, but the application of that at the national level is so fundamental and so important. If we consider for a moment what has been achieved since Trygve Lie was Secretary General, appointed in 1946, it is undoubtedly astounding. I think it is to be applauded, but certainly not to be taken for granted. As a man who escaped occupied Norway to fight fascism with the Norwegian government in exile, he may also have a few words of wisdom to share with us if he were here today around where we see political discourse going and the negative trends that we see so apparent around the world. And I think not least this is embodied by, as was described earlier, the shrinking of civic space and the threats that we see posed to human rights defenders, which have become so apparent in the last decade and more. 2 decades ago, we were in a period of optimism, post-Cold War, the flourishing of democracy, the promotion of human rights around the world. Then, unfortunately, we had 9/11, the counterterrorism agenda, we had a global recession, and we find ourselves, I think, on the back end of that. But I, as I will outline in a second, nevertheless remain optimistic, but there are certainly many challenges that we need to fight. And I think we're in an era of countervailing opportunities and threats. And for each opportunity we see, there is, as I say, a countervailing threat that is being posed against it. On the one hand, very positively, we are certainly in an era of growing transparency, of the availability of data and of access to information legislation, which is now pretty much ubiquitous around the world, not necessarily equally applied, but certainly present. But at the same time, we have this process of shrinking civic space. We have finance, registration controls. We have pushback on protest. We have labeling of activists and organizations as foreign agents, stigmatization of them, pressuring of judiciary. And we have increasing controls being applied around issues of national security and cybercriminality, often in a quick copycat process of legislation passing from one country to another without due consideration or analysis in relation to human rights. As the Special Rapporteur on Freedom of Assembly and Association has recently pointed out, counterterrorism laws are being widely used against human rights defenders, and states are often interpreting security and rights as something to be balanced rather than rights promoting security and underpinning security. Another trend we see is obviously the spread of the digital revolution. When the declaration was passed 20 years ago, it didn't even mention the internet, but it's now a central component of almost everything that's discussed. And there has been a massive boon and benefit for human rights defenders in the open, decentralized nature of the internet. I would, of course, note that half the world's population still don't have affordable or meaningful access to the internet, so we shouldn't dismiss that. That is a huge challenge, but nevertheless, certainly the benefits are there to be seen. But this is also accompanied, of course, by the spread of hate speech online, by greater digital surveillance, the use of governments to track and harass human rights defenders. We see greater criminalization of content online than in the offline world. And we are only just beginning to understand the human rights implications of artificial intelligence and the use of algorithms in decision-making. And these are huge areas that need to be further explored and understood. Another trend, we see very well-established models of media self-regulation and co-regulation, of editorial independence, of professional journalism. But at the same time, has been mentioned, we see ongoing attacks and murders of journalists, 900 in the last decade alone, according to UNESCO. We see quick-moving legislation pushing back against trends around disinformation, such as legislation on fake news, which are not well thought through, which open themselves wide for control over different types of contents and for eroding press freedoms and media freedoms. And we see the clear co-option of mass media by vested interests and political groups, particularly as the internet begins to erode the traditional commercial models for those media. And last but certainly not least, we have a trend of progressive international standards. Last week, or this week alone, at the Human Rights Council, the resolution on safety of journalists is one example, and different mechanisms and institutions. We could look at certainly the SDGs as another example. But at the same time, governments blaming and scapegoating multilateralism for domestic woes, pursuing chauvinistic foreign policies and eroding those mechanisms as at the same pace they are built. So there are opportunities within this long litany of challenges that we face. And I'm very pleased that many governments around the world are striving for higher ideals, such as Norway and Tunisia and others. And I think it's very important that they continue to do so. And I would thank and praise the Norwegian government for leading on the question of human rights defenders, for the human rights defenders resolutions, which are invaluable, and also for events and opportunities like the upcoming Civil Society Human Rights Defenders Summit in Paris later this year, and of course the Younger High-Level event later in the year as well. So to try and be very concrete, things that I think should and must be driven forward in order to make this a reality. Well, certainly at the international level, we have the Human Rights Council, and notwithstanding the departure of the US from that body, it remains strong and it remains important, and it's important to be invested in. As mentioned, we see still strong resolutions coming out of the Council. We see important country issues being discussed, as was the case, as I say, this week and last. But the Council needs to be strengthened. It needs greater compliance with recommendations and implementation of standards. There needs to be more robust competition of member states to join the Council and reviews of their human rights records when they do so. There needs to be more resourcing of human rights, and I was very pleased to hear the announcement of $85 million, as I'm sure the High Commissioner was as well, for OHCHR and their work with the Council. And there needs to be protection of those who speak out and are brave enough to engage at the Council. There are many other aspects of work that needs to be undertaken. Changes to the ECOSOC NGO committee, ensuring greater transparency of UN bodies, access to information and public participation. There needs to be greater involvement of civil society and human rights defenders in the UN's counterterrorism architecture. We need to leverage the SDGs and their role in calling out, or the possibility to call out, states that fail to defend the defenders. At a regional level, we see positive trends like the Escazú agreement, which is encouraging, especially for environmental defenders. But I think most importantly, we need to close the implementation gap. I think was very eloquently said, papers that can have beautiful policy on them, but they don't necessarily reflect reality. And we need to make it a reality. There are many national action plans that exist. Article 19 is one of a number of organizations continually tries to apply those plans at the national level, whether it be the UN plan on impunity and safety of journalists or the Rabat plan of action on equality, non-discrimination and freedom of religion and belief. Even if they're not implemented by name, there are many useful components, such as repealing laws that are used to target human rights defenders, ending impunity for killings, protection mechanisms, taking online threats seriously, especially those targeting women, and very importantly, ensuring that media, but politicians and authority figures speak out. So as I mentioned, I'm an optimist. I think these are concrete, achievable goals, and certainly fora like this encourage me that they can be achieved. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Thomas, for mapping some of the threats and some of the possibilities and stating goals for the work ahead of us. Terrific. It is now my pleasure to turn the floor over to Florence, who is the Special Envoy for the Global Alliance of National Human Rights Institutions. Florence, you have the floor.
Thank you very much. And may I take this opportunity to thank the organizers for inviting GANRI to this high-level panel. And once again, on behalf of GANRI, we wish to congratulate you, Madam High Commissioner, on your appointment. We look forward to working closely with you as we have done with your predecessors. There is no doubt that being the premier human rights defender is no mean task, but we believe that you are up to the task. As we celebrate the 70 years of the UDHR and 20 years of the Resolution on Human Rights Defenders, it is important that we reflect on some allied key principles of the UN, such as peace and stability and solidarity. It is also the 25th anniversary of the Paris Principles, which govern the establishment and operations of national human rights institutions. There is much to celebrate. Great advances have been made in establishing norms and expanding the spheres of protection for the most vulnerable. The UDHR is now accepted as the most enduring standard to which leaders and state parties must be held accountable. Commitment to the ideals and values of human rights cannot, however, be achieved by curtailing the very freedoms that nurture them, such as freedom of assembly, association, and the inherent right of all individuals to scrutinize and hold to account all those that wield power. A vibrant civil society, supported by expansive civic space, is a prerequisite for the realization of human rights. In this regard, as members of GANRI, we believe that national human rights institutions cannot exist in isolation. They must exist within the same space as civil society. And therefore, we believe that where civil society is weak, the national human rights institutions will also be weak. Where national human rights institutions are strong, civil society will also be strong. Now, state parties are expected and have increasingly committed to establishing NHRIs that are compliant with Paris principles. States, however, can undermine the same principles by having weak legal and policy frameworks, and also by ensuring that NHRIs do not have the requisite resources. They can also undermine the Paris principles by having individuals appointed to NHRIs that are not independent of the state, that are not independent and that are not objective in the carrying out of their mandates. To date, GANRI has commendably a membership of over 100 national human rights institutions. 69 of them are fully compliant with the Paris principles, but obviously this is not an easy task. As the link between national, regional, and international human rights mechanisms and actors, NHRIs are at the forefront of enhancing realization of rights where it matters most, that is at the local, community, and individual level. Together with other human rights defenders, they have come under criticism and targeted for reprisals. Obviously, the reason why NHRIs and other human rights defenders are targeted is because they work very closely with those whose rights are violated. They also cooperate routinely with UN agencies, with regional human rights mechanisms, and this obviously is unacceptable, taking into account that the UN is actually founded on human rights principles, and therefore it would be expected that state parties that are members of the UN should fiercely defend those who seek to expand the space of human rights. In response to some of these threats, GANRI, together with OACHR and UNDP, have established an MOU and guidelines on reprisals, especially those that target NHRIs. But obviously, at the national level, most human rights defenders look up to NHRIs where they exist to be their defenders, to be their protectors. And therefore, if the defenders are not protected, then woe betide the individuals that seek to work on human rights. Another area that I must address is that, to their credit, state parties have recognized the need to address the issue of threats and reprisals against NHRIs and human rights defenders generally. And so we have a number of UN, UNGA and HRC resolutions that actually speak specifically to reprisals against NHRIs, as well as human rights defenders that do have a specific resolution. Additionally, if we look at Goal 16 of the SDGs, which is so fundamental to this issue that we are discussing, that is a global movement for peace, Goal 16 has indicators that include the existence of independent national human rights institutions in compliance with the Paris principles. Again, it also has as a requirement that states should provide data on the number of verified cases of killing, kidnapping, enforced disappearance, arbitrary detention, and torture of journalists, associated media personnel, trade unionists, and human rights advocates in the previous 12 months. So clearly, state parties recognize that human rights defenders have come under increasing pressure, and they therefore require these reports. But obviously, reports should not just remain reports. We expect that these indicators will also enable the state parties and other actors to evaluate, to monitor, to be able to measure the progress that we have made at the global level, at the regional level, and at the national level in protecting these fundamental actors in the cause of human rights. There is no gainsaying that while human rights are guaranteed at the international, regional, and national level on paper, in practice, the story is very different. while all of us are expected and required to promote and protect not only our rights, but those of others, and particularly the vulnerable, and further, while there is clarity on the role of the state as the duty bearer, the reality on the ground is that this very basic right, that of speaking out, mobilizing against violations, is under serious threat. In many regions of the world, state parties have curtailed the fundamental freedoms such as those of assembly, expression, to the extent of jailing, maiming, torturing, killing, and creatively and deviously using existing oppressive laws against those who dare stand up and attempt to speak to and challenge perpetrators. So therefore, we must ask ourselves, in line with this, what can the international community do? What can the regional community do? What can we do at the national level? As GANRI, our members work on a day-to-day basis at the national level. We also give reports at the regional and international level. And we believe that expanding civic space, ensuring that the gains that we have made in the human rights world is never dropped, that the space keeps expanding is so critical, that documentation, monitoring, investigations of violations against human rights defenders must be the key plank that ensures that we continue to expand the human rights framework, not only the framework, the human rights discourse, but also the realization of human rights at all levels. We believe that looking at the current environment in which human rights defenders exist and work, while it is not encouraging, the norms that exist, the SDGs, the conventions that exist, the resolutions that exist, must be our benchmarks. We must use those at all levels to hold the states accountable. And obviously, as has been mentioned by previous speakers here, some states are not just violating rights because they want to violate rights. Some of them are under-resourced, some of them do not have the wherewith of where to start with this, upholding and promoting human rights. As national human rights institutions, we believe it is our responsibility to carry out education, to advise the state and state agencies on how best to protect the rights of citizens. And therefore, we work in collaboration with state parties to do this. As a last point, I would just like to say that once again, we'd like to thank the organizers. I especially want to thank Norway. I heard that they have given funding to the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights, which is the most critical body, I think, for human rights defenders in the UN system. But Norway has also been very supportive of GANRI at the international level, as well as the regional levels, because GANRI has regional networks in Africa, in Asia, in the Americas, and in Europe. And all these networks work together to look for the best practices on how to protect and promote human rights. So I wish to thank the Royal Government of Norway for the support that they have given and extended always towards NHRIs. Now, it is important to mention that Norway does have a vibrant national human rights institution. And I think it's important for us as human rights defenders to agitate for and to ensure that our state parties actually have NHRIs that are independent, that work towards these goals that we are discussing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that very passionate statement on how to defend the values we are all standing for. Before I open the floor, we will hear from a special guest who will be making a brief intervention before our discussion with the audience begins. So we will now hear from Larissa Galadza, who is the Director General for Peace and Stabilization Operations Program in Canada. You have the floor.
It's always good to be here at IPI. I know when I see 777 United Nations Plaza on my agenda, it's going to be a good day. So thank you for having me here. Like many member states represented here today, Canada was proud to co-sponsor the Human Rights Defenders UN Consensus Resolution in 2017. And as we celebrate the 20th anniversary of that declaration, it is a good moment to reflect on the challenges faced by those who put themselves at risk to protect and defend human rights. As many have said already today, we are at an important point in this discussion. The strength of global human rights norms is being tested in all corners of the world. If we wish to achieve the peace that is the promise of the United Nations, we must collectively stand up for the rules-based international order and the place of human rights within it. The organizers of this event asked what governments could do to improve the protection of human rights defenders. And I look forward to hearing some of those concrete and practical advice from the floor. But let me share with you how Canada has been working to respond to the challenges. Because when it comes to protecting human rights, we need more than good intentions. We need to walk the talk. In 2017, Canada developed guidelines with practical advice for government officials around the world on how to support human rights defenders. These guidelines can be found on the Global Affairs Canada website. We recognize that individuals from vulnerable and marginalized groups are particularly at risk. We are therefore in the process of updating our guidelines to strengthen gender considerations and to add specific guidance to support certain categories of human rights defenders, such as the advocates of LGBTI rights. The work of human rights defenders is increasingly moving into virtual spaces. Canada is supporting organizations such as Access Now and Stichting Hivos to protect these digital defenders. Finally, it's important that we recognize and support youth to stand up for their rights. Canada supported consultations on the progress study on youth, peace, and security and is looking at those recommendations. Canada continues to strive for a world where individuals or groups can advocate for their rights without fear of retribution, leading to more peaceful and stable societies. We recognize and support the fundamental importance of this work, of the leadership of everyone at the front of this room, and I thank you for this opportunity to share Canada's work.
Thank you very much, Larissa. Always a pleasure having you, and thank you for the kind words. I'm now going to open the floor for questions and comments. For those who are in the room, please raise your hand and state your name and affiliation before making your comment or asking your question. So let me start in the middle there, the gentleman with the blue tie.
My name is Felix Medallia. I'm a human rights defender from Nicaragua. First of all, Madame Bachelet, let me say how proud I am to see you in your position. I am the former Secretary General of the Ministry of Defense in Nicaragua, and you were an incredible ally in helping us demine Nicaragua with the help of Norway and in your leadership. So it's an honor to see you now in this new role. A big concern that I have now in the organization that I preside over, the Institute for Strategic Studies, is that we work very close with the United Nations. I recently gave a statement at the UN Security Council concerning the very, very serious situation of human rights in Nicaragua under the Daniel Ortega regime. Close to 500 people killed. At some point, one peaceful protester was being killed every 5 hours. Over 1,000 people in prison at this point. Is that those who work very closely with the UN system are particularly targeted. In fact, 48 hours ago, a judge just ordered my arrest. My assets had been frozen. I have been charged with charges of terrorism that are extended to my team. 12 people on my team are arrested. My colleague Angel Gaona, who was my journalist, was killed in the first 2 days of the protest. The High Commissioner's office from the UN was expelled from Nicaragua. So I know I have a very brief time, but there's this tiny country in the middle of Central America that for over 160 days has been crying to the world, we need help. It's just impossible. One student was just killed yesterday in the hands of the police. This goes well beyond ideological issues. And Mr. Ortega has been able to do that precisely because there's a sort of nostalgia to the Sandinista revolution. I am the son of a political prisoner during the Ortega regime. When he went to Chile to study, he was expelled during the Pinochet dictatorship. Even that, it's so painful to see that the Sandinista revolution now has turned to something completely different. So once again, I know I don't have enough time, but my concrete question will be, what can we do, and particularly from your position, to help those of us who work with the UN system and are completely disregarded by the Ortega regime? Thank you.
Thank you. Yes. Thank you very much. I will take two more questions, and then we'll go back to the panel. But please keep your interventions concise, sharp, and short. I will then move to the gentleman there on the right-hand side.
Hello, my name is Mark Goldberg. I'm the editor of UN Dispatch and host of the Global Dispatches podcast. A brief question for High Commissioner Bachelet. What effect might the cutoff of U.S. funding to your office have on your day-to-day operations? Thank you.
Thank you. Short and sharp. I will then take one more question from the lady behind you.
Hello, my name is Eleanor. I'm with the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom. I was wondering if the panel could expand on ways and means to protect human rights online, in particular in relation to rights to privacy, freedom of speech, and information access.
Thank you very much. I will then turn to the panel. Anybody who wants to start answering the questions and commenting on the interventions? Michelle?
I will have to start because two questions were for me. Well, the first thing I would say is that we are aware of what's happening in Nicaragua. Our office, as you just mentioned, was expelled from there. Our task, we don't have until now a special mandate from the Human Rights Council on Nicaragua, but we don't need the task because we have the mandate to be reporting and monitoring, and if they have expelled the office, and probably the Commissioner of OAS is also not having access to Nicaragua right now, we'll continue doing it remotely. So we'll continue it informing, reporting of the human rights violations in your country. And in terms of what can we do exactly to protect human rights defenders in there, well, I think it's a very difficult issue because, as you may know, when you don't have access to the government either, to try to ensure that they make the right thing and they don't do the things you have mentioned. But we will be speaking out for the voiceless, speaking out for people like you that need to have the safety to come back to your country. But I don't know if now it's safe for you to go back there. So we need to continue working. We have told the government, because the Minister of Foreign Affairs visited me in the Human Rights Council, that we told them that our office was willing to go back because they said they haven't expelled us, that it was just the end of the mission. So we said we're ready to go back under certain, if I would say, criteria, under certain requirements. I don't think that will be real. I think, but we're going to continue speaking out, and I think there is as an important there is clarity in the international community of what is happening. So I expect not probably this week, but maybe in the future that there will be resolution and clear, I would say, more active and strong measures to change the situation in Nicaragua. But of course, we all would like peaceful political ending of this kind of situations. And we will work, as me, as High Commissioner, we will speak up about it as many times as is needed. And on the question of Mark, what does it affect us? Well, first of all, the resources are, where the resources are going, it's a decision of the Congress of the US. We have not heard officially that those cut of resources are coming. We have heard words from some officials saying they're going to cut the office budget. In case there could be a cut, that will be an important issue because, of course, the contribution of the US is important. Also through, not only through regular budget, because regular budget comes to the UN, so it's not earmarked, that is for office and so on, but it will affect the fund of protection of victims and families of victims of torture. This is a very important fund that help us to give victims of torture or family of victims of torture with physical, psychological support to reintegrate to societies, etc. So it will be very bad for those people who have been victims of authoritarian governments, of governments who don't respect human rights, that not have that particular support. But as I say, we're still optimistic. We still hope that for next year, we will continue receiving the US resources. This is a matter that will be seen in Congress, and we hope, because we need to remain optimistic in this office, that they won't be cut. Maybe the other ones can respond. The other ones.
So thank you very much, Michelle. Are there any other of the panelists who would like to comment on any of the interventions we've heard? Please.
The question around human rights online, I think, is a very pertinent one. And of course, it's been established in various resolutions that the same rights that apply offline should apply online, but that is not the reality that we see unfolding before us. Obviously, the internet and its decentralized and very rapid nature creates a very different form of expression, a very different form of accessing information. But it has also created a whole range of new sets of terminology, and it has overturned various standards which have been well established for many years, whether it be around counterterrorism with the advent of countering violent extremism, or whether it be around misinformation and disinformation, and now these new fake news pieces of legislation, fake news being unto itself a misnomer, but that's not to belittle the problems that are faced around the rapid communication of misinformation, or even more harsh penalties online for issues around defamation, as an example. So I would actually highlight two kind of key components. There are many components within this, but I think there are two key things which we should be focusing on. The first one is the intersection between human rights and technology standards. And there is a huge body that functions, with some exceptions like the ITU, actually through multi-stakeholderism pretty much outside of the realm of the United Nations, which brings together private sector, brings together technology actors, to a much lesser degree, civil society, although that's changing, and certainly Article 19 is engaging heavily in some of these bodies like IETF and IEEE. And the protection of these bodies and the continuing application of human rights and understanding the interaction between human rights and rights like expression and privacy and so on and so forth, and how technology standards are literally coded, i.e. how an open and decentralized internet works, are extremely important. As are understanding the implications, for instance, of machine learning and the use of algorithms, which de facto tend to build and maintain and sustain discrimination and marginalization with communities because they are individuals who are not engaging and the machines are not learning from their interaction. So we need to stop and pause and think about the implications of this and to look at the possibilities of doing human rights impact assessments. The other one that I would mention very briefly is around content and content regulation. And this is coming like a steam train as well, if I can put it that way. And states are increasingly looking at how content should be regulated online, and at the moment are pushing this very heavily towards the private actors that are, the social tech giants, but also ISPs and other actors as well, and looking at private censorship through terms and conditions. Now, these private actors are not default malicious actors, but they will, of course, protect their commercial models, and that means that they will take content down if there's any danger of it impeding on their commercial model. So they themselves also need protecting, and we need models in place, maybe taking from the traditional models we see around print media regulation of self-regulation, but putting barriers in place between state and private actors, giving individuals the opportunity to have recourse. And recourse here, we mean on a massive scale. I mean, the number of takedowns that these companies do is in the millions. It's of a scale that is unprecedented. But there needs to be mechanisms built so that the companies have a role, civil society has a role, individuals have a voice, and states can have proper content regulation, but at arm's length, not direct involvement. So those are the two areas I would highlight.
Thank you very much. I will now open the floor again. We have about 15 minutes left, so I will ask you to be very, very brief in your interventions out of respect to all the people who have asked for the floor. So I think we will go to the front row.
My name is Hadia Tajik. I'm a member of the Norwegian Parliament. First, I'd like to thank the panel for very interesting remarks. And I have a quick question when it comes to the idea of universalism, because that seems to be, an idea that is under severe pressure these days, the idea that human rights are fundamental and equal for all. And even though this is a very interesting seminar, I'm guessing we all do agree that human rights are fundamental, but as we already have experienced in the General Assembly, not all state leaders and not all people agree on this. And one state leader, and I'll leave him anonymous, even said that we will not tell you how to live or worship, and that that way of thinking refutes the idea of universalism. And my question to you is just basically, how should we push back and fight against the pressure that the idea of universalism is under these days?
Thank you very much. Can you please raise your hands again so I can see who has asked for the floor? The lady right there. Yep. Here, in the middle.
Hi, my name is Jacqueline Horton. I'm from the Dropbox Foundation. My question is, how would you like to see the private sector step up in helping move these initiatives forward?
We will then take maybe 2 more questions. Yeah, please. The lady there.
Hi, I'm Tess McAvoy from the International Service for Human Rights. The representative of Norway previously mentioned the importance of prevention, and so I wanted to ask a question. Given the recent failures previously in relation to Sri Lanka and more recently in relation to Myanmar, how can the OHCHR and the UN system in general work with human rights defenders, who are often those that are sounding the alarm in terms of human rights crises, to do better in relation to prevention? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think the interventions now have been so short and sharp that I will take a couple of others before I go back to the panelists. Can you please raise your hands? There is a gentleman here on the right.
Thank you very much. Vasu Goundan from Accord. Madam Bachelet, you've said that the paper sometimes doesn't reflect the ground. You also said the preference would be for peaceful settlement of disputes. And one of the major challenges that we've had, and I think, Tej, yourself with FAFO, you would know, is the dilemma between justice and peace, and how do you reconcile those things in an era where there's increasing impunity. And I think now we're going to see, unfortunately, you come at the worst time, I think, for human rights in the world, because we're going to see increasing impunity encouraged by powerful forces in the world. I'm a human rights lawyer myself, and I've been a victim of human rights abuse. My father and I both were jailed in South Africa. And the last 25 years, I've been working on conflicts on the continent, and we know there have been increasing conflicts in Africa now. Lots of human rights abuses, and we're trying to get peace settlements. How are we going to reconcile that? That's a challenge we've never managed to resolve.
Thank you very much. Before I go back to the panelists, I have a couple of questions myself. And the first one is when you address human rights abuses, and the second one is on how you address human rights abuses. And the first one is on timing. Since I've I was an SRSG and a special envoy of the Secretary General in the field, representing the political wing of the UN. And what I sometimes experienced was that when I was very close to reaching agreement between difficult parties, then suddenly there comes a human rights press release, either from Geneva or from New York, and one of the parties refused to speak to you. So the peace deal you were about to do falls apart because one party feels humiliated. So, and that's my first question. My second question is how? And sometimes when you address human rights issues publicly, it's counterproductive because it hardens the position of the entity you are addressing or the persons. And it's, but if you do it privately, you can achieve an agreement and correct a situation. But not always. So, I mean, but these are hard choices and real dilemmas when you work on human rights and peace. So that was my question. Who would like to go first? Michelle?
Yes. I don't want it to be a title of a news media, but when he was saying, how should I mention you as a courageous woman? And I said, because I love to make jokes, maybe as a masochist, because the real thing is that it's clear what you said. It's a very difficult times for human rights. I'm not a masochist. It was just a joke. I just cannot help myself. If I feel that I can help, that I can make a contribution, I will be there, like a soldier for the human rights. And the dilemmas that you have mentioned, are dilemmas that have made me think a lot. I mean, first of all, the Human Rights High Commissioner has a lot of mandates. Before deciding to be a candidate, I wrote a lot of articles on how the situations were. And one article said the undoable job. So that was very optimistic and full of incentives to accept the task. But because the High Commissioner needs to do many different things, first, of course, it needs to be the voice of the voiceless. But as you said, sometimes you can make other steps before. And you can be the voice of the voiceless when nothing else has functioned, because sometimes you need to use other strategies that can be very, very smart and that can have good results. Not always, many times never, but you have to use it. So it needs to have sort of like political diplomacy, preventive diplomacy in terms of engaging governments on their issue, because as Florence has mentioned, many countries do have issues, but not because it's a state policy. It's because they don't have the capacity of their institutions or their police forces. And so the office, what does is technical cooperation, capacity building. Many countries of the world have asked us to support their judiciary reform, for example. Or to, and we will have with the minister, I think later, other panel that's called about good stories on human rights, because you usually speak about the bad stories, but there are also good stories where things have gone in another way and they have worked right. And I think Tunisia is one very good example of a good story. So, I mean, what I've been thinking, there's not one recipe, first of all, because country by country there are different situations, different levels, different attitudes to human rights. So as I'm thinking, we're going to strategize much better when to speak out, when to do the other things, which are the steps, and who does what. Because the High Commissioner could speak every time. That's not a problem. I can do it. But we need other people to stand up also. We all need to stand up. But of course, High Commissioner many times have to stand up because maybe that won't change the government's attitude, but it will support human rights defender on the country. So this is a very complex situation that that doesn't have a unique recipe, and you have to put all those things and think which is the smartest and the thing that can have results. Because to be honest, probably because I come from the executive power, I want to speak out and be the voice of the voiceless, but I want to have results. Only to denounce, and that's it, it's not enough for me. I want to have results. I want to support people's rights and to support human rights defenders. So that's why in the how and the when, we need to discuss, we need in the office and with our colleagues and with others. And the second thing, we need to
coordinate ourselves in a better manner. There's a special envoys. There are SRSG in different parts of the world. There are people working on the Global Compact on migration. So we need to be better coordinated because, as you said, if somebody is working, like a very accurate way, different way, and I do something that will break that down, I'm not helping the human rights people. So, and the human rights of the people. So we need to coordinate well. But having said that, one of the things that people ask from the High Commissioner is to be independent and to be the voice. But we need to do it in a smart way so that we'll have results. And if not, because not always you have results, in an adequate moment. The second thing that I wanted to take from myself is, and that's the same with the challenge of justice and peace. I mean, I think transitional justice is one of the most difficult things, and you have seen different models that have worked differently. And I don't think, again, there is one single recipe, because it depends also on the feelings of the people, what they do want to do first, and when they do want to do second. And in Chile, for example, we had a very successful, and in South Africa too, very successful transition from dictatorship to democracy. And at the beginning, the victims, what they were more interested about was to know the whereabouts of the victims, of the families, if they were alive or dead, where were their, I mean, if their remains, if they were dead. So that was the first part. But then we could advance on truth, justice. We took a lot of people to jail. I mean, we were held accountable, many people, and they went to jail. And so every process is different. The Colombian process has some particularities. So I think, but there is, I think, interesting model to look on, but it's not, again, because it depends on the culture and the history. I'm not saying that culture can explain crimes. I'm saying that the environment of the country, how the justice system will work, how peace is understood, can have different models than that. But on the other hand, every process after a war, internal war, that is sustainable, durable, needs accountability and justice. Because when there's no accountability and justice, perpetrators feel they can continue doing what they have done in the past. So I think you can find the ways of doing, you can sort of see what steps you have to, how you can get into a agreement from the parties for a peace agreement. But in some minute, soon or after, you need to have people being accountable and have a justice process. The other question about, I don't know if I have an answer, Madam, but what I think is that we have seen in many countries that they use sovereignty as a shield for human rights violations. Of course, the UN Charter speaks about sovereign equality. And there is a part of the countries that, of course, we can accept that sovereignty exists, but it cannot be an excuse for human rights violation, war crimes, genocides, or other kind of things. I mean, sovereignty means something completely different. But I think we need to fight back to make countries who are, we need sort of an alliance, if I may say, but not only of the traditional ones. We need to include more member states that can, stand up and say, this is not acceptable, this has to be universal, because it's on the safety of all of us, finally. We need to find the narrative that is the most adequate one. And I think I'll stop there, because I could spoke about the other things, but, private sector. We had this week a meeting with the Global Compact on the private sector on human rights and also on the Sustainable Development Goal. And I think there is a growing movement of companies, businesses, who understand the importance of human rights and who can feel that respecting human rights is not only the right thing to do, but also the smart thing to do. And many of the companies there were talking about their experiences. And I think it's very important to have champions. Like Paul from Unilever, he's championing in the world for human rights and companies and human rights, companies and climate change. So I think we have a group of champions, but we need to increase it, expand it. And because some people don't want to make any change. They know they are damaging the planet and so on, but they don't. But I think there is some hope in this, because what I've heard the other day, I was very, very well impressed. So there are a lot of companies in different areas. Even now, all those oil companies are included there, and they're doing something. So I think we can do much more with the private sector, and we have to put a big effort to that.
Thank you very much, Michelle. May I ask the rest of the panelists to give very brief concluding remarks? Florence, can I start with you?
Okay, I'd just like to respond to the issue about when and how you speak out. I think that for my experience as a chair of a national human rights institution, the most important thing I think for human rights defenders is to have credible information, to have facts that are very clear, that are supported, because I think that when you speak to state parties, obviously they have more superior ways of getting information and destroying your evidence. So I think it's the smart thing to do for us as human rights defenders is always to be very well prepared, to know our facts, and then to be strategic in how we use those facts. I think that is where the alliance between national human rights institutions and civil society is so important. Because national human rights institutions are actually state bodies. They are established by constitution or by statutes. And they have to work together with civil society because sometimes the strategies and the tactics that they use may be different. And so I think it's important that at the national level that alliance is strengthened so that national human rights institutions should be able to speak in certain situations, and then civil society should also be able to speak in certain situations. They should be able to use their unique mandate that allows them to interact with parliament, with the judiciary, and with the executive to actually enhance the voice of civil society. So I think that there are choices that are made. I think the worst thing that state parties really, really dislike is being embarrassed, being ambushed, being information that is circulating that has not been presented to them and is being used according to them adversely. So I think it's important to be very diplomatic in how we use information and also to use persuasion, because I think that sometimes naming and shaming is important, but persuasion can yield better results. So I think that those are some of the ways that I think it's important as actors at the national level to really use. I think with regard to universalism and sovereignty, personally, I think that states that use sovereignty against human rights are really just being pretentious because they trade with other countries. They have invasive systems that have gone into other countries, other nations. So if you're trading unfairly with other nations, what reason do you have to then protect yourself with sovereignty? Because you're using other countries that are weaker than yourselves to actually gain unfairly. So I think that that is why the solidarity of state parties, the solidarity of humanities, of all of us as citizens of the world must really be used against sovereignty that is so selfish, that does not recognize the responsibility that we have towards other citizens, towards other human beings.
Thank you very much, Florence. Gemayes? Audun, would you like to say? Audun is sitting in for Ina. Audun is the Deputy Foreign Minister of Norway.
Thank you, Terje. Just a few very quick comments at the end to some of the great questions that were raised by the audience. To pick up on the private sector, I would just like to point out, I think Thomas hit the spot in his previous intervention. Right now, I would say this technology nexus and the dialogue, the regulation of private sector and the technological part of that, going down to technology standards, pure coding, and content regulation is actually at the core now of the engagement of the private sector in the human rights space. Also for the question of when and how, I would also point to coordination, whole of government approach, looking at the whole spectrum of tools. And I think for all of us, this is always a difficult balance. You know, how do we secure the results on the ground? How do we message most efficiently? How do we create the wanted effect and not generate pushback? And I think the question of concrete results and outcome needs to guide our choice of channel, the tone and content of our substance, and the level of public versus private criticism. But we should never be afraid to engage, and we should never be afraid to raise difficult issues, even when they are politically inconvenient. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thomas, famous last words?
I'll try and make them famous. So very briefly on both the question of when and how, and also on universalism, I would say that and lament actually the presence of the human ego in the middle of diplomacy. It really shouldn't be there, but unfortunately it's a reality that it is. But I would remind leaders that when they speak to one another, they speak to the populations of their respective countries. So to speak out is also one thing, but not to is another. And that has a direct impact, not only in terms of the leader you're speaking to, but also the communities that they are responsible for. And I would finish by saying that whilst leaders, unfortunately and fortunately, come and go, rights don't. So I would say in terms of universalism, we need to stay the course.
Thank you very much, and all that is left to me is to thank you all for being with us this morning and for a very inspiring conversation. And I would particularly like to thank the distinguished panel. I think it's been a fantastic team, so we give them a big hand and wish them good luck.